I'm really pleased to see all of you here. This is, I think, going to be fascinating. I didn't know I came as the expert on weirdness, but I can do that too. Tree of Life 2011 is, I think, just an extraordinary movie. I bet half of you have seen it, maybe more. Then, as Tiffany said, the really interesting thing that we get to do tonight is think about the relationship. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. The relationship between the film and Gilead. There's, to me, pretty clearly a kind of invisible conversation going on between the two things, between the film and the movie. They share lots of things in common, and it's as if they were in each other's pockets almost, talking. And I think you as a community are just completely prepared to take that in because of the time that you've spent with Gilead. So it's a long movie. It's 2 hours and 20 minutes, so I don't want to talk very much now, and I'm not going to talk very much later either. I want to just get to the film. So I'm going to just say two things at the start that I think might be useful as you try to both take in the film and then think about the film talking to Gilead. So first is really interesting to me. Gilead, the novel, ends with the same verses from the book of Job that the Tree of Life begins with. So when you see the Tree of Life, the first thing you're going to see is a quotation from the book of Job, Job 38:4 and 7. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth, ... when all the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So that's a really pretty extraordinary quotation. And it's doing a couple of things, right? God is, speaking to Job. He's in a way putting him in his place. Where were you when I did all this? But deeper, I think, is that God is describing to Job creation as an act of love, right? That what God did when he created the universe and us, what he did is he made some portion of himself visible, right? He expressed himself in an act of love, and he expressed himself so that creation could echo back that love, could, the way Malik says, is reflect back that glory, the way Edwards says, reflect back that glory. So that's what that quotation from Job is, I think, really about, not just be quiet, Job, but that the entire universe is shouting with joy and praise at the fact of creation, at being created, at being loved. So in Gilead, right, in the novel, that comes at the very end, where Ames is talking about the light on the prairie at dawn. Do you remember that? This is where you should nod. The way it sort of floods the prairie and overwhelms him with a sense of goodness, right? God creates and it's good. God is still creating each dawn morning in Iowa, and it's good. Ames says, there may have been a more wonderful first moment when all the morning stars sang together. That's Job. But for all I know, to the contrary, they still do sing and shout, and they certainly might well. So Ames is really saying that first moment of creation is essentially still going on, right? That God is pouring himself out, right, as the dawn light hits, and the sons of God are responding back in praise. So if you think of Gilead, one of the ways to read it is it's a long, extended act of praise. Ames taking in the glory of the world in his son's face and the light, and all those images. So that's pretty interesting. Ames goes through a long, complicated testing to get there, right, a struggle, and he sort of fails that vision any number of times, but he gets there at the end. Well, in the Tree of Life, and if you know any other Malik movies, you know these phrases, the same idea is there, but essentially the vision has been lost. Malik talks over and over, or his characters do, about all things shining. That's probably his most famous quote. When you look at this from the Thin Red Line, when you look at the world, all things are shining, essentially with glory. But there's something in every one of the movies, one of the characters says, that prevents us from reaching out and touching that glory. So the way I think about the tree of life is that all things are certainly shining in that movie, but the central character is in a struggle to take that in. Okay, and I want to just give you just the barest bit of this without ruining the plot, as if there was a plot. So I'll do it this way. There's a central figure in the movie. Jack is his name. That's confusing because one of the figures of Gilead is Jack, but Jack is the central figure in the movie. He's played by Sean Penn in his 50s, and he's played by a local kid named Hunter McCracken when he's age 12. And then he's played by actually a couple of other figures too at smaller ages. But they're the two main versions of Jack. Jack at age 50, Jack at age 12. The Jack at age 50, whose consciousness really, for me, runs the movie, is speaking to God, really, about having lost the sense of God's presence. He's lost the sense of there being any glory in the world. So Jack, Sean Penn, is lost. And if I read the movie right, it's a day-long meditation or a day-long kind of wrestling with God in which Jack/Sean Penn thinks through his childhood, which we get for hours. He thinks through his mother. He thinks through his father. He thinks through his brother. He thinks through the roles of all of those people in having taught him to touch glory like Ames, and probably have taught him to fumble glory, to lose it. And you'll see all that. But by the end of the movie, I think you'll decide this Jack character, Sean Penn, returns to that vision of glory. Now here's my only joke of the night, is if you can imagine the son of morning shouting with joy and it being Sean Penn, that means it's the very slightest twitch of his lips at the end of the movie that I think, at least for me, sort of shows this return to the sense of sort of vision and glory that Ames shares as well. So I think that's one of the things that maybe as you're watching this, I'd love to have you explore. Okay, the second point, and this is the last one I'm going to make. Structurally, and this is kind of putting it mildly, the film is pretty challenging. I mean, we're used to that, but it's still pretty challenging. When I first saw it, people walked out. When I first saw it, I was with a buddy who hated it, and I pretended I hated it because I didn't want to be, really, I wanted to be like everybody else. So it's complicated structurally, but I was blown away, really, when I saw it. I just had no language at the time to talk about it. So that may be your experience as well. But I want to give you a little help structurally if you want. And at this point, you can close your ears, and that would be fine. The best thing, I think, is to just trust it, that it's great art, and go with the flow, and let it explain itself. But there are a couple of other things that might help. If it is, in fact, the adult Jack's meditation on his growing up and glory and how he lost God and how he's finding it, then that means it comes to us in meditative order and not chronological order, right? Lyrical order. It jumps all around, and that's okay. But there are maybe four kind of basic sort of figures, I think, or things that I would think about. And this may be telling you too much. So there's an adult Jack figure. That's Sean Penn. He's wearing a suit coat mostly and has a gray shirt on. This may be too much information. And the day that the meditation takes place is the anniversary of his brother's death about 30 years ago. So he gets up and goes to work in towers and all that. So there's that. Then there are minutes and minutes and minutes of this adult Jack's memory of growing up in a small Texas town. So we get these just remarkably cool scenes of his childhood and that sort of thing. Two things. Third, there are Jack's sort of speculations about how his mother, and somewhat his father, but how his mother mostly took in the world. And the most sort of acute thing, he's trying to figure out how his mother handled the death of his brother. That launches this just remarkable birth of the universe and scene that goes on and on forever. But it's really his speculative thinking about how his mother, when she confronted God, got an answer. So that's what that's doing in the film. And then fourth, and this seems silly to say, but I'll say it, there's another Jack who keeps wandering through the movie, who's also Sean Penn, but he has on a white shirt for if it matters, and not a gray shirt, and he's in these more abstract scenes. He's in the desert, he walks through open doors, or he's afraid to walk through open doors, and he has various visions. That Jack is, for me, a kind of an inner Jack, if that makes sense. There's the outer Jack who has one kind of shirt, who's going to work and has a wife and remembers his brother. And then there's an inner Jack who's lost, bereft, wandering, ecstatic, all that kind of stuff. So those things together, I think, might be plenty. And I don't want to give away the rest of the movie. Okay, so enjoy. So here are just some simple things to think about: the connection between Gilead, which is what you've been thinking about all year, and what you just really lived through. Both pieces are about, this is really obvious, but they're about vision, they're about seeing, they're about taking in glory. In a way, both pieces are as much about that visually as they are about that linguistically. In some of Malick's movies and in this one, it almost doesn't matter what's said, it's what you see. You understand the whole argument about God's love being expressed back. And Gilead does the same thing. It's obviously in language, but the most powerful parts of that novel are not the conversations, they're the descriptions of rivers and trees and water flowing. So that's one. Two, both works are about wandering. So think about Gilead first. Remember that scene where John Ames and his father go to Kansas to look for his grandfather's grave, and they get lost and they almost starve to death. But in the middle of wandering, they have that incredible vision of the moon and the sun reflecting glory back and forth. And then later in the book, Ames says, well, when he lost his wife and child, remember, he said, I essentially spent 30 years or 40 or whatever it was in the desert wandering, right? All those years of my wandering. And then later in the book, when Ames gets lost before Jack, the Jack of Gilead, he sees his beauty and he's terrified of him. He describes that also as lost as he's ever been. So that's a book about being lost, and out of being lost comes vision, the moon and the sun, or the beauty of Jack. And then what we just saw really, for me, is about wandering as well. That's why Sean Penn is out in the desert. He's as an adult working as an architect, but he's spiritually wandering. And on this day, in the middle or passing through his wandering, he essentially gets his mother back and he gets his brother back. You know, the best lines in the movie are mumbled. I had to watch it with subtitles to get it all. But right at the beginning, Sean Penn says, "Mother, brother, they led me to your door." Right? He's talking to God, but it's his mother, you know, all that openness to glory, and then it's his brother who's so willing to forgive and all that. I'm going to weep. Who led him to God's door, and then it's his mother and father wrestling within him, as he says, that brings him to the door and then takes him away from the door. So anyway, they're both about wandering and coming to see. Okay, this one it's harder to explain. When early in the movie, the closed-off architect, 50-year-old meditating Jack asks God, how did she bear it? Remember that? And he's talking about how did she bear the loss of my brother, and which was years later than the movie. It was when his brother was 19, but clearly that loss has frozen Sean Penn up inside, I think, and he's trying to figure out why his mother didn't freeze up from that. Well, that, for me, that whole vision of creation and everything that follows is really his speculative answer as a meditating adult as to how she bore it. She bore it because in her pain, we were talking about this at dinner tonight, in her sorrow, she realized that creation and God himself were pouring out their love towards her, towards them. And that's how she bore it. It didn't make the pain go away, but she was in a world that was directing its energy, God's energy, towards her. And this is the part that I'm not sure if I'm right about, but the speculation, how does she bear it? And then she's out there screaming in the woods. And then 80 minutes later, she's there in the woods again. So almost everything in between is the speculation of how she bore it. So I just asked myself one time, well, what's in between? And what's in between is the vision of creation, right? Which is light exploding and then contracting, over and over, right? It's pulsing and nebulae are formed and galaxies and then planets with that kind of pulsing. And then our planet is formed, and then life is formed, and then more complicated bits of life are formed, and then human beings are formed, and then this family in Texas is formed, right? And then this 12-year-old, or this boy Jack, is formed, and then this boy Jack goes through a pulsing which is called age 2, and a pulsing that's called age 4. Do you see that? And then one that's called age 12, and then we do that for a long time, because the pulsing called age 12 means I hate my father, it means I love my mother, it means he wants to kill me, it means all that kind of stuff. And if I read that right, that's all in his speculation about how did my mother bear it. And here's where I don't have words, I just have the movie in my head, but it's as if to say that the same energy that was pulsing as light and planets and life and complexity was also the same energy that was pulsing as me, excuse me, and my brother and my family and the complicated dance and struggle in my head, as if to say that the act of creation that went on is still the act of creation that's going on. The love poured out in the original Let There Be Light is still the love poured out on Jack as this 50-year-old Sean Penn, but remembering his way back there. I just think that's, I can't think of anything cooler I've really ever seen. All of that is in a way there in Gilead too. It's in a way just acted out in Gilead in the pulsing beauty of the world and that sort of thing and the give and take. But it's there in one or two sentences in which Ames says to his son, I love these lines from George Herbert, and I do too. And the lines are this: preservation is a creation, and more, it is a new creation, a creation every moment. I had to study that and look it up and see where it came from, but Herbert is saying, and Ames loves this, that because we're preserved, because I'm here this second and the next second and the next second, that means there's a new creation each moment. There's a new pulse of light. There's a new pulse of love that we're surrounded by. So if I'm reading that right, Ames and Jack in his speculation really have the same view of creation. And then one last point, and then you're free to leave. They're really both works of great wrestling, aren't they? Jack is wrestling with the two voices in his head. Ames is wrestling with his love for Jack and his fear of Jack. That's kind of what makes those novels go. But as they wrestle, I think I want to say both of them wrestle imaginatively. These are really great acts of imagination. And you see it in The Tree of Life in the movie. It's a little hard to explain too, but there are scenes where the Sean Penn Jack in the white shirt is in the middle of scenes that he couldn't have lived through, right? So he's there imagining his mother's suffering and his father's suffering. In fact, at one point he touches her on her hair, right? She doesn't feel it because he's not there. So he's imagining that. He's imagining her sorrow. He's imagining her coming through it. It's really a great thing. I think that's what that last scene is about too. I don't exactly think it's heaven, although a lot of people do, but it's sort of like the white-shirted Jack who's walking through it, right, is is imaginatively putting the pieces of his world back together, right? He's giving his father back to his mother, and he's welcoming his lost brother back and all that sort of thing. It's as if he's imagining the parts of him that he had muted and let go dead come back into a kind of whole again. Anyway, it goes on all the way through the movie. Almost my last sentence now. And that's exactly what Ames does if you think about it in Gilead. He's imagining, isn't he, the life of his father. He's imagining the life of his grandfather, most of which was vanished to him. And I thought of this afternoon as I was scribbling some notes, and this is the last sentence. Ames, in a way, is imagining, isn't he, his son after he's dead, after Ames is dead. He's imagining his son reading this. And he's all but, this might make me cry, but he's all but touching his son on the head, isn't he? The way Jack does in this movie. He's all but reaching through time, through this act of imagination, to make a kind of wholeness and a kind of healing. Well, these two things do exactly the same thing. And I think if I hadn't been given this strange assignment, I never would have thought of that. But there it is, kind of in plain sight. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to talk to me, I would be glad to. But thanks for coming.